Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our first Emerging Ideas event of 2022. My name is Shannon Watson. I'm the founder and executive director of Majority in the Middle. If this is your first introduction to our group, welcome. The goal of Majority in the Middle is to make our political and civic culture better. We're giving those in the middle a place to gather outside the back and forth. We are elevating voices of people who are modeling the behavior we want to see. And we're working on ways to bring a little more civility and a little less partisanship to our politics. We're asking a lot of questions about why partisanship and division has become the norm. We're looking for places where division exists and wondering if it really needs to. And we're hosting a space for people who are interested in politics to gather in the middle without blame for being on one side or the other, and without being asked to give up their own beliefs and priorities. A couple of housekeeping points as we get started. You've probably already noticed that this Zoom is in meeting mode, not webinar mode. So you do have the potential to be on camera or on mic. So take a second to mute yourself if you haven't already. We are going to spotlight the speakers, so they should be taking up the majority of your screen. So it's up to you whether you want to leave your camera on or off for this portion. We do encourage social media interaction during the event. Use hashtag #EmergingIdeas. And I'll put our social handles in the chat in case it's hard to find us. Our moderator has a handful of questions, and then we'll go to audience Q&A. So if you have a question, it's best to put it in the chat, and then Kim or I can call on you. Kim, I don't know if you're going to be able to see the hands coming up. This event is being recorded and will be available for viewing on our YouTube page sometime in the near future. Got a whole bunch of people coming in now. So we have until 7 p.m. with our panelists. We will also be leaving the Zoom room open for up to a half an hour after event. We do this to give you a chance to network or give feedback or continue the discussion. So with that being said, let's get to it. Our discussion tonight focuses on the origin story for one of my favorite podcasts, Wrong About Everything. Brian McDaniel and Javier Murillo are at the forefront of work to overcome partisan divides, elevate civic discourse, and foster relationships. And I gotta say, it is hilarious as well. 3:15 on Friday afternoons has become appointment TV for me because they live stream the podcast on Facebook as they record it, and it's fantastic. Our moderator for the panel is former reporter, current podcaster, and comms extraordinaire, and Majority in the Middle board member. Please welcome Kim Inslee. Kim, thanks so much for doing this.
It is my great pleasure. Thanks for everybody who's joining, and for those of you who have been hanging in trying to join. We apologize for the delay there, but we're very happy to have you with us right now. Before I get started, and I don't think Brian or Javier will mind me saying this, so Wrong About Everything is available for you to support on Patreon. And I encourage you to do that because you know what? It takes money to put these things on. And these guys have been doing it for a lot of years. So let's start with the introductions. Brian McDaniel is a stand-up comedian. He's a political pundit. He is an attorney, a Minnesota governmental relations professional with over 20 years of experience working both inside and outside of the Minnesota State Capitol, and also a professor, right? If I have that correctly.
Yes,
all right.
ma'am.
Adjunct professor, do I have that correctly? Javier Murillo is an advocate, teacher, former president of the Service Employees International Union, SEIU, Local 26, political strategist, and he appears regularly on local talk shows talking politics. He's a progressive commentator all over Twitter as well. And Javier is joining us as well. So welcome, Brian and Javier. Nice to have you with us.
Happy to be here.
These are the two founders, by the way, of Majority in the Middle, that's us, of Wrong About Everything podcast. And this is this is a podcast that I discovered a number of years ago and struck up a friendship with Amy Koch, one of your compatriots, and ended up doing a story on you guys. And I'd like you to tell us that origin story because I think it's really important. People log on, they hear the podcast or they view the podcast, but they don't know how it all began. So Javier and Brian, either one of you can just launch into that.
Well, I'll let Javier start us off because he actually was the, it was his original idea. But I do have to say, we are appointment viewing at 3:15. except for the next couple months, because we have to move to 4 o'clock or 4:15, because Amy and I are too busy. So we're gonna start a little bit later. So,
But you're on at like 1 o'clock in the morning on Minneapolis TV, right? I mean,
That too,
keeps
yes.
getting pushed back, but it's there.
they keep moving us back. The saltier
The
our language.
swears, yeah.
Yeah. So every time Brian is the one who kind of keeps time on the podcast, and he'll say like, oh, so it's been 5 years or 6 years. And now I think it's almost 7 years that we've been.
Almost 8.
Almost 8. Jeez. And I'm in denial about my own aging. So it's hard to wrap my brain around that. But 8 years ago, so I was, listening to podcasts at the time. And I had this idea of, but I reverse the order. I established back during the marriage campaign, meaning when the constitutional amendment to ban same-sex marriage was on the ballot. Brian and I were both pundits, and we would spar on At Issue or an almanac. And at one point when I was at the Capitol, we sort of waved and said hello, and he started a game of Words with Friends with me. And so we started playing Words with Friends and use the message chat to kind of get to know each other. And I discovered from the message chat that he was incredibly funny, not a great vocabulary, but really funny. And we laughed a lot going back and forth. And we particularly had a lot of fun making fun of our own parties to each other, and that was amusing. And so then my love of podcasts at the time, I just had this idea that it would be an interesting thing for a Democrat and a Republican to to get together and talk about the week's news. And so, we decided to do it at 2 and 2. And that's kind of where it began. I'll say that, and I think, and should have started by saying thank you for the invitation, and this is really fantastic, that there are certain things about how we have defined the project, or how I think about the project, that have changed over that time. It's always been very important for me to say that we are not about kind of getting together to agree on things, or the purple, every time there's a purple caucus announced anywhere, it's just snore. I find it so boring. Because I think that part of the end result, I'm sorry, if you hear snoring, that's my dog. He's snoring very loudly. Part of I think what has happened with polarization in this country is that bipartisanship gets defined in the most boring ways, and in a way that I think seems to assume that in order to have a conversation, you have to check your deeply held values at the door. And the podcast has always been for me about people disagreeing. We don't have to get to agreement. Sometimes we do. And I think that's fantastic. I think, but we're not about finding a middle point. It was a really much more simple goal of just people talking to each other, and it was also important to me that it be relaxed and funny, that we be funny with each other, because I think we live in increasingly siloed existences in this country in a way that I think is really, even 7 years ago thought was dangerous, was that we don't know each other well enough. And humor is about crossing boundaries. And what you find funny, it can be very limited to your silo, right? What you joke about with your friends is different than what you joke about with strangers. We say, we can say really offensive things to our friends, but we know each other and know what our intentions are. Mm-hmm. And so to me, it's always worth the risk of offending, but laughing together. So that was, and what I'd say about kind of our trajectory is that the Trump years, we started this way before the Trump years. The Trump years made it both a lot harder to do the podcast, and also it felt more urgent and more necessary.
Yeah, let me dig into that a little bit. Brian, because I wanted, based on what Javier has just been saying and getting into that idea of some incredibly difficult years that, as adults, we've never experienced anything quite like it. How do you measure the importance of the podcast now versus almost 8 years ago when you first started it?
Well, I mean, it was a very different podcast when we started it. I mean, I remember, first of all, the first 3 episodes you will not find anywhere in the world because they are unlistenable. They are horrible. But I scripted things for the first one because I had never really listened to a podcast, let alone been on one. We used to do, podcast bingo, and we would have Mad Libs and stuff. And it was we would still talk about the weighty issues of the day, but the issues then were just not quite as weighty, or at least they didn't seem as much. And then as the years went on, just kind of more and more heavy stuff started happening, either with the police shootings, there's too many to remember, but Jamar Clark, Philando Castile, well before George Floyd, and Amir Locke. When ththese things would happen, you can't be funny about it. I mean, you shouldn't even really try. But the podcast, I think, gave people who were looking, and I don't want to like overstate our importance, but I think a lot of people wanted a safe space to go and listen to people who weren't just yelling at each other and who weren't just reading talking points, or weren't just saying my side's always right and your side's always wrong and you're a bad person if you don't agree with me. I mean, one of the early premises always was someone can be wrong without being evil. And we wanted to have the conversations that you had with your friends at the bar. You would yell at your friends, you would get worked up, but when you leave, you'd hug, and then you'd see him again in a week and have the same conversations or something new. So I do think that without overstating its importance, I think that we remained, certainly on the local level, relatively unique. And most podcasts, I think the average is 10 episodes, and we're almost at 8 years. And it's been through some, we've had some lineup changes, but the amount of trust that got built up, because at the beginning, Javier and I knew each other, but we weren't like anywhere near what we are now. But what we found was the more you actually talk to people, the better you understand them. Doesn't mean you agree with them, but you understand them, and it makes it possible to listen to them. Mm-hmm. If you don't trust them, if you don't like them, if you don't give them a chance to say how they feel, well, then you're just going to be talking past each other. And I think that if you look at modern American politics, it's Republicans saying one thing, Democrats saying something else, and never the twain shall meet.
The trust that you have in each other is evident. And I'll say, there have been times that you guys tear into each other pretty good, and yet you bring it back around. But that trust that's built up, I've heard each of you say things that I wouldn't have necessarily expected you to say, because it seemed to me there was a shift in how you think about things. And Brian, you straight up brought tears to my eyes. We've talked about this before, after the January 6th rioting, your statements on that on the podcast just made me tear up, and it gave me hope that there were people who put other things above their party. So personally, have the two of you, because of the trust and the four of you have together, have you felt yourselves move on positions? You talked about listening to each other, but have you felt yourself move on positions in ways you didn't expect?
It's interesting because we've been asked that question before, and I think part of the challenge of answering it is that as people, we always think of ourselves as immutable, and so I kind of like, my first reaction is no, I stay true to who I am, and I never have, and I also love Brian's statement after the after the insurrection, in part because he said that I was right. And that was the thing that pained him the most about it. But I think that how I can really answer your question, Kim, is to say that what it has changed is how I approach a question, right? That like, because meaning that you can disagree just as vociferously, just as strongly, but start from a place of understanding where someone from can come at that opposite opinion from a place of good faith, which I think was a big personal leap, and I think for a lot of people, like we have a hard time believing that sometimes that when someone believes something that we find really objectionable, that there's good faith there, that just like, well, we joke a lot on the podcast about well, the Republican, like it's always racism, and Democrats is always whatever it is, and so it has changed my approach in that way, I approach the questions, and I find that incredibly valuable, because before this podcast, I didn't, other than members of my family, and I didn't have any close friends who were Republicans, and I didn't really actually know many Republicans, but to me, getting to a point with folks of trust where we're outside of the realm of politics in any way, that there's just something inherently good about having people who have different ideas than you and who you would disagree with a lot, nonetheless being people who meet like the chicken soup test, like the test of like that if you're sick, they'll bring you chicken soup. Mm-hmm. That I think is an inherent good, which is really very difficult to achieve in our very siloed existences in the country today. And I think it's gotten us to a place of real danger.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel that too. Brian, I think Brian has disappeared somewhere.
Yeah, I was wondering where
I think he left you high and dry. There he is. While he's logging back on, I do agree with you. I feel that there's a danger that I have not felt before, because people have pushed themselves so far away from the center, which is kind of one reason why this group is here, right? It's that there is some common ground. One person asked a question here. I want to read it. As an early listener, it feels to me that your emphasis has changed as you have changed jobs, roles, and are working as consultants more than being policy impactors. Do you feel this too? And Brian, you represent in your business people that you politically may not agree with. I mean, you represent Democratic interests, you represent Republican interests. So as your role has changed over the years, has that changed how you approach the podcast?
Sure. First of all, I apologize. I got kicked off, so I'm back on now.
It's obviously Shannon's fault completely.
It's Shannon's fault. But I mean, yes. I mean, I spent a lot of years as staff for the House of Representatives. I was staff for Governor Pawlenty. So I've done my time as kind of like an insider political guy. But even when I was that person, I kind of felt like the business of government necessitated that you trade A for B, because you value B more. And, my first year working at the Capitol was 2000, which is, 22 years ago. And, back then you were allowed to do that. I mean, you had pro-life Democrats, you had pro-choice Republicans, you had, and everything in between, and deals would get made. And so I think that, the whole time I've been on the podcast, I've been a lobbyist. But I think that I have the luxury of honesty just because I've done so many things before this that I was established. And I think sometimes the Republicans don't like me, but I'm family, so they can't get rid of me, that type of thing. And with the Democrats, they like me a lot, but I'm just a friend. So, I kind of know where my bread really gets buttered. But sometimes it's been difficult. Like what it's public record. One of my clients is the city of Minneapolis, And, there's had to be a lot of dancing, and I've represented them through multiple mayors. But, there have been times where as a Republican, I really probably, would be expected to maybe go a little harder, but my knowledge of what the decision-making process is kind of, I have to be true to that and kind of make my politics be, or make my statements be honest to me. So I think that it would be difficult as a lobbyist to do this. A lot of lobbyists wouldn't even want to try it. But as I said kind of earlier, I have a hole inside of me that can only be filled with attention. So I've been lucky enough that every place I've worked since I've been on the podcast has, been supportive of this. And so, I think I can count on one hand in 8 years how many times a Republican or a Democrat kind of like took issue with anything I said. They seem to just kind of allow me to do it.
Well, you both have, the backgrounds that you both bring, deep in experience, but also in negotiation skills. And I feel like you teach us through example how we can speak to one another, behave, I guess, have civil, sometimes uncivil, but get back to civil discourse. Do you have advice for people, as we look for ways to try to find more bipartisanship, ways to approach that?
Yeah, so it's interesting because for as many times as we've been asked the question that, that like, how have I changed? Have I until just now when Brian was describing, his role as a lobbyist from Beth Ann's question, is that the thing that we really have in common at a core is that we're negotiators. That we that I spent 14 years as the head of a labor union. And so that's the basis of my career. And you can't have in negotiations a position of like, well, I can't talk to that person because that person is the boss who has the money in my case. And so it can't be that principle that I will not engage with the business class or the capitalist class, which some of my, more lefty critics, I think might prefer. You come in. And so actually, I think, to answer your question now, Kim, I think it's taking that worldview of negotiation, because in negotiation you go in when I would plan with my members, we'd always start negotiations, and as we're preparing, we start a list of what are the things that we deserve, and that list is very long. And then the other list is what do we have the power to win right now. And that negotiation is the process of moving things from what we deserve into the what do we have the power to win column. And that I think is just a helpful way of thinking of how you can disagree without checking your values at the door, is that I want all of these things, but in order to get something done for the state or the country, I'm not going to get all of them, and I need to concede to my opponents in some way. So I think that model of negotiations is something that I want to spend some more time thinking on now.
Brian, what would you have to say to that?
Well, negotiation is right. That's certainly, an apt comparison. But part of it is I think my experience, I'll only speak for myself, is that the people who I work with at the Capitol, whether they be elected officials or staff or other activists or other lobbyists, we're not different. We're all broken in the same way. And that drew us to politics for one reason or another. But I don't find it hard to understand Democrats and still like them. Not all of them, but a pretty large number of them, because I don't expect them to think the same as I do. And I also, don't look at my side and say, well, we have all the answers. And in fact, lately we have very few answers other than how to win the next election, which seems inevitable. And I don't understand how that's happening, but it is. So I think that having done this now over 20 years, that, you kind of just learn and that, everything's cyclical. And if you're going to be an a-hole to people when you're in power, well, then you're going to have to expect to be treated pretty poorly when you're not in power. And, I've won elections, I've lost elections. I lost a job at the House of Representatives because it flipped Democrat. And, I could have been salty and sassy and all those things, but then, I wouldn't be able to lobby them later on. And so, in a roundabout way, it's a little bit, it's negotiation, but it's also treat people the way you want to be treated, and realize that we're in a closed world. The real world is not politics. Politics is very small. It's a small town, and I think to be successful, you have to be able to coexist.
I like what you said about cyclical, because I think the thing that scares me is that we're getting to a position where we're not cyclical, right? Like it's like something's happening that's beyond that, which Joe has a question that may or may not riff off of that, but it's an interesting one. Are you concerned the caucus primary process forces candidates to go too far from one side or the other side, that there's no way for them to propose moderate policy positions in the general election? So they're just so far apart, the only way they get attention is by blowing up things on one side or the other.
Well, I'll be happy to start, and Javier can answer that. I mean, I think the answer is yes. Once upon a time, candidates would go far to the right during the endorsement or primary process, and then for the general, they would move back to the middle. That doesn't happen anymore. I remember, maybe the first time I really noticed it was in the Republican gubernatorial race, whatever year that would have been, where you had Jeff Johnson, you had Kurt Zellers, you had all these other people, and they were all, relatively of the same political philosophy. One of them got endorsed, and then the rest of them ran in the primary, but in no way, shape, or form changed their views to appeal to anyone differently. And then with the Tea Party, I think that provided a ladder for like the Michelle Bachmans of the world and other people to kind of jump to the front of the line, because they didn't have to go through the traditional process of consensus building within the party. They were able to go on Fox News. They were able to go on these more right leaning entities and get attention. And thus, people saw how you get attention as by being loud, being strident in your views, and that just doesn't allow for your political views have to be different than your religious views. You shouldn't compromise your religious views, but you have to compromise your political ones. That's politics, but people don't do that anymore, at least not enough.
Yeah.
And so I guess where I have a problem with the formulation of the or the assumption, I guess, underlying the question is that I think that there are problems on each side, but the problems are not necessarily commensurate. Sorry, I also have a puppy who's banging things around.
That's the best part about Zoom, though. That's why I love it.
Yeah, Bonita, please. Yeah, thank you. Is that I think we have different problems each side when it comes to the question of this question of polarization, and like that, as a Democrat who has tried to move the party to the left, and as a student of history, right, the mainstream Democratic positions today, right, would be Nixonian, right? And in that president's age, that we are at a time where the conversation has moved so far to the right, that that we don't have the equivalent of people in power as far to the left as there are people on the right now. And what I mean by that is this, that, we have, I think, this week we might be starting to see some cracks in, the national unity of, the inability to say that the Republicans lost an election. I think that there is something fundamentally different when we have one party that, for whom like a good number of national leaders seem to believe that the only elections that are valid are ones that they win, and that is a different problem. Which is not to say the Democrats don't have any problems, but that is a different one, and it takes us on the brink of something I think dangerous. I think there's a lot that our side does that contributes to, I've been describing as, that I feel like our civic society in the United States is on a carousel that's been spinning out of control, and we seem to not be able to get off of it. And as I used to teach Latin American history, and it scares me where it looks like the country is going, where everything that we are, both sides, political parties are doing is contributing to this sense of just deep break of social cohesion. I think that is the real problem that we have, that is adjacent to the partisan one, but the partisan problem being we need two parties that believe that sometimes we lose elections.
Mm-hmm. It was interesting that you brought up Nixon. I was very surprised the other day, I won't say remember, but to realize that he created the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. I mean, that's kind of, to your point, where we've moved. There's another question here too. How has the loss of rural Democrats or urban Republicans hurt negotiations?
Well, I mean, I think it. I mean, Republicans, they can, if they want to choose to, they can ignore Minneapolis and St. Paul. And I think that a lot of Minneapolis and St. Paul Democrats feel that like they can ignore rural Minnesota. If you don't have a caucus where you have, in my time, we've never had a Minneapolis or St. Paul Republican, but we had first ring suburb, Republicans, and we, once upon a time, the Democrats had the Iron Range. They that would temper some of the environmentalism, and Republicans had, soccer moms, back before, Trump drove them all away. But once upon a time, you had to formulate policy that not only satisfied, I'll just speak for my side, angry white guys or rich white guys or rural white guys. And you can win some elections sometimes. And Republicans have been very successful in greater Minnesota where there are white guys. But we've seen in the areas where it's not all white men, they've continually lost support and can't win statewide.
Yeah, and so like this question brings me back to 2018 when I consider myself part of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, I think there are a lot of Republicans, especially ones on Twitter, who think I'm a socialist and are communists and like far out there. And I always want to say, let me introduce you to some. I know them, and they think I'm a sellout because I do things like talk to Brian. But I think that in 2018, one of the reasons that I was passionate about the Walz-Flanagan ticket was that when we look at our neighbor state of Wisconsin, to me, we've been on a path that could lead us to real extreme polarization, which I think that state, which used to be very similar to ours politically, is in a very different place. And to me, 2018, we knew, just like cyclically, like everyone says, this year will be a good year for Republicans, that 2018 was going to be a good year for Democrats. And for me, it was a question of saying, I think any Democrat we nominate is going to have a good shot at winning. But how we win is incredibly important, because to me, what is dangerous is not so much, that there are no Democratic legislators from rural areas, but that is a symptom of something of the actual problem, which is just how siloed we've become, and how that Democrats have given up on, I feel like we are the ones who can make the case to connect the pain of a small town where parents are hurting because their children have no way to make a living there, and are moving to cities, and that's very real loss and very real grief happening there. It's our job to connect that grief to the grief of folks in North Minneapolis, and to make the case that we are a connected state. So I thought it was incredibly important in 2018 that our message be one of unity, not so that we win necessarily in Greater Minnesota, but we can't lose as badly as we have been losing, because that is leading to cultural real balkanization. And I think in 2018, right, both Wisconsin and in Minnesota, Democrats had a good year at statewide level, but the urban-rural divide got worse in Wisconsin. The areas that had voted for Scott Walker voted for him in greater numbers then, and so and I think that we reversed the trend then. I suspect that this year we'll be going back to form, right? So it's all a roundabout way of answering the question. I think that the fact that each party has lost geographic areas is in terms of representation at the Capitol, is a symptom of something deeper and even more problematic than just who's being elected.
When it comes to the podcast, you've done a good job of bringing people in from various, all sides is kind of a dumb way to put it, but from the different parties, different perspectives. Do you ever have people who are afraid to come on because they don't want to be labeled something, or they don't want to be seen with a Democrat, or they don't want to be seen with a Republican, or don't want to play friendly with either side?
I think yes. We have real lives and real jobs and travel and all that. So a lot of times, we're looking for guests from time to time, but we're also looking for co-hosts. And sometimes we're trying to find elected officials or other people in the political arena. And I would say much more often than not, they're very happy to do it. They like doing it. But there are certainly people that maybe once were on the podcast who don't want to come back for one reason or another. But I think that for good or for bad, the podcast at the Capitol, the podcast is a thing. And I said earlier that all political people are kind of broken in the same way. So I do think that even when people, really disagree with someone on the podcast, they still want the attention and they still want to be on there. Though I think that for the most part, when you bring in people from the outside, until they're on it 2, 3, 4 times, they kind of come in scripted, or they come in a little bit more talking pointy, or they want to make the points that they think Amy and I should have been making, just on the Republican side. But that's good. I want different opinions on there. And, if somebody's going to come on and be more to the right of me, that's good for the show.
Yeah. Was there ever, did you ever have a guest on that you were like, oh my God, this was a mistake?
Keith Ellison.
So Keith is a friend, and I also will say that he didn't quite grasp kind of the whole idea behind the show. I think we had a guest once where it got, we get heated with each other, but it got really pointed in a way that felt just like had to say, hey, we don't do that here. We're not actually literally going to physically fight each other. I think the harder time we have is finding people who are just willing to relax and be funny. you know, even people who are very funny in their, when you meet them, they're just like, you know, relaxed, like, you know, sort of tense up, and that's, you know, and it's not for everyone, but I think, yes, Shannon's just wrote in the comment that Michelle Benson was surprisingly funny. That was exactly my reaction. I did not expect her, as you know, she had seemed sort of more buttoned up, and we've had legislators, like, for a while we'd say, like, you know, there's been enough distance between this and now that I can admit there have been times where, like, no more legislators are so damn boring, like, and John Kosnick comes on and he's been doing he's done a good job as a sub, but, like, God, sometimes you're just like, oh my God, get off of your talking points and just smile and just say something, like, inappropriate, because, like, that.
But I think Shannon pointed out earlier, you know, that's a risk, right? That gets taken out of context. It's a risk and it's used against you. We have a couple of questions I want to get to. More people of color and young immigrants in rural Minnesota and some of the smaller cities. So will this eventually change the balance for the white guys? Anyone?
I mean, it has to a little bit. I would like to think that the Republican Party, because once upon a time, you know, we didn't do so terrible with Latinos, you know, and then, you know, we you know, stopped being pliable on immigration, and, you know, just kind of trusted that, you know, Catholicism was going to lead to pro-life votes, and that's just, you know, people, you know, they have their views, but that's not really no one's a single issue voter anymore, or at least not very many people. And Republicans, I think, you know, made that calculation incorrectly on that. So, I mean, I think that there's, you know, we have seen Republicans make strides in the last 5 years, 10 years with labor that I never thought was possible. So because of that, I mean, with the Iron Range, which was the bluest blue in all the land other than Minneapolis and St. Paul, for it to be pink or even red tells me that nothing is forever, and that you know, I think positions don't change, but circumstances do.
Steve wants to know, what advice would you give statewide office candidates on how they can get things done, considering extremely heated extremes and changing demographics, you know, and they have to get elected, right? So how does a statewide candidate approach that?
So I'll, you know, limit my advice to Democrats, because that's who I want to win statewide, but also who I feel more qualified to answer. I think that what Republicans do really effectively that Democrats are just terrible at is that when, like, if I hear another Democrat when talking about Greater Minnesota, if their first bullet point is high-speed internet, I'm gonna lose my damn mind, because it's super important. It's very important. But I feel like we come to Greater Minnesota issues armed with facts, and Republicans come telling a story that hits people in the gut, and gut will always win. And to me, the biggest failure, that collective failure of progressives and of Democrats in this state, is that there is a narrative for us to mine, which is that, like, Minnesotans, like, don't leave this state. Minnesotans are like, have you know, a zeal for Minnesotanness that is only rivaled by Texans, and they're kind of jerks about it. And you know, we're more, you know, not so boastful, but very proud, right? And we're a very connected state. And so the you know, I feel like when you talk to Greater Minnesota folks about the Twin Cities as a political issue, right, you might get one kind of answer, but when you ask people about their grandkid who lives in Uptown, it's a different question, right? So my advice to folks, you know, running statewide, is to talk about those connections, is to talk about us being a state where we don't need to agree with each other. We just need to acknowledge that we are connected to each other. Mm-hmm. That, like, you know, that we eat because farmers are producing, and and the Twin Cities are an economic engine for the whole state and providing jobs for young people, whether they're in Greater Minnesota or here. Like, we are a very connected state, and so I find that we we Democrats always miss an opportunity to tell a story that people can identify with at a cultural level and feel like they want to be a part of that story. Instead, we list things like, well, more of the urban taxes go to Greater Minnesota than vice versa, which, true, but also not persuasive. No one cares.
Yeah, that story is definitely important. Brian, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think the Republican problem statewide is, I think charisma is the key to opportunity, and I don't know that we have found the right candidates that can, that appeal enough. Javier is right. Democrats don't need to win Greater Minnesota; they just need to lose by less. Republicans don't need to win the suburbs; we just need to lose by less. But we haven't statewide been able to find a candidate that runs super well in Greater Minnesota and does well enough in the suburbs. And I think a lot of it is personality, and people have to like you to vote for you. Not always, but it helps. And Jeff Johnson is somebody who went to my church growing up. I've known him forever. I've been a fantasy football with him. I played cards with him. I think he is hilariously funny. I never saw that as a candidate.
What do you think about what's shaping up for the GOP side of the governor's race then?
Well, I have favorites there, and I have people who are less favorite.
Do we put much stock in the what just happened? Kind of a popularity poll.
I think you have to put a little bit of stock in it. If somebody has the most money, if somebody does the best in the caucus straw polls, I think that you can't completely say, oh, okay, well, we're talking about Scott Jensen. You can't say that his support is maybe as soft as some of the other candidates would like to say it is. I think that there are candidates that would run stronger in the suburbs than Scott Jensen. But it's one of those things where, delegates are just way farther to the right and to the left than the general population. And it's made it a little hard to kind of get a more well-rounded candidate to run, to get endorsed and then win a primary and then actually run statewide on the Republican side.
Well, we're going to listen to Wrong About Everything to hear everybody's take on that for sure. Shannon's giving me the timeout signal. So I personally want to thank you, Javier and Brian, for being on this program, but I also want to thank you for the 8 years. And I know how hard it is, the 8 years that you put into this podcast. It truly, hands down, not blowing smoke up your skirt, is my favorite podcast. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you very much for having us and for listening.
Awesome. Kim, thanks so much for moderating a really good discussion. Brian and Javier for doing what you do. And I think Kim said it best, so I'm not going to say it again. I'm going to put a couple of links in the chat. The first one is the events page on our website. We're just getting rolling with emerging ideas events for the year. The next one is 2 weeks from tonight. So sign up for that one if you're interested. I will commit to figuring out what went wrong with the link situation before the next thing, because I'll tell you, the guy who does our video is going to get about 15 minutes of blooper reel of me freaking out about the Eventbrite link. So sorry about that. I do also need to make a pitch for financial support to Majority in the Middle and Wrong About Everything. Javier, do you want to do that part?
Yes.
Nope.
Well,
Okay.
Now I'll pitch it the way I always do on the show, which is
Of course.
Patreon exists, to support artists. We don't get paid for what we do, but it does cost money to put on the podcast. And so if you listen, I always say, if you listen and you enjoy the show, and if you can afford it, we would ask that you spare us a few bucks, because if you can afford it and are listening and are not sparing a few bucks, you're kind of being a dick. So
Majority in the Middle is not nearly as colorful with that, but maybe 8 years in, we will have some sort of catchphrase for people.
I'll say it for you. I'll say it for you.
Awesome. Okay. All right. We're putting on the calendar. Let's see. February 8th in 2030
Yeah.
would be our 8-year anniversary. And
That's
Javier
right.
can yell at everybody for not financially supporting us. That would
Yeah.
be awesome.